In the unforgiving heart of the West, a woman's survival depended on three things: her wits, her aim, and the horse she trusted with her life. For Amelia Hayes, a homesteader living on the edge of nowhere, her stallion Saul was more than a horse. He was her freedom. When a dying stranger collapsed on her doorstep, whispering of ambush and betrayal, she faced an impossible choice. In an act of desperate compassion, she lent him her horse, her only means of escape. It was a kindness she thought she'd regret. She had no idea he'd ride it back, leading an army to her door and igniting a war that would scar the entire territory. The wind in the Red Rock Basin had a voice. Most days, it was a low, mournful sigh that swept down from the mesas, carrying the scent of dust and sage. It was a lonely sound, but to Amelia Hayes, it was the sound of peace. Her small, sturdy homestead, a sod-roofed cabin, and a corral built with her own 2 hands, was a solitary island in a sea of ochre and burnt sienna. It had been 3 years since the fever took her father, leaving her with nothing but this harsh, beautiful land, a Winchester rifle, and the finest horse in the territory, a golden dun stallion named Saul. Saul was more than livestock. He was a silent confidant, a partner in survival. His coat shimmered like spun gold in the brutal sun, and his strength was the engine of her life. He pulled her plow, carried her to the distant town of Redemption for supplies, and was her only guarantee of escape should trouble find its way to her door. On a blistering afternoon in late August, trouble came. It wasn't the thunder of a posse or the swagger of land prospectors. It was a flicker of movement near the cottonwoods that lined her dry creek bed. Amelia, her senses honed by solitude, went still. Her hand rested on the worn stock of the Winchester, leaning against the porch rail. She watched, her grey eyes narrowed against the glare. A figure stumbled from the trees, a broken puppet of a man, lurching a few steps before collapsing into the dust. Caution warred with a deeply buried instinct for compassion. This land was cruel. It bred cruel men. But the way he fell with such finality spoke not of threat, but of desperation. Slinging the rifle over her shoulder, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the wilderness. He was dressed in the tattered remains of a U.S. Army cavalry uniform, though the blue was stained nearly black with blood and dirt. A dark, ugly wound seeped through the fabric on his side, and his face was a pale, sweat-sheened mask of pain. His lips were cracked, whispering words too faint to be carried on the wind. She knelt, the rifle held ready. "Mr. You alive?" His eyes fluttered open. They were a startling clear blue, a stark contrast to the grime and blood. They held a feverish intensity. "Water!" He rasped, his voice a dry crackle. She fetched her canteen, propping his head up, and letting him take small, choked sips. He drank like a man who had forgotten the feeling of moisture. When he was done, he sagged against her arm, his breathing shallow. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice low and steady. He seemed to struggle, trying to focus on her face. "Ambush. Blackwood's men." The name hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Silas Blackwood. The name was a poison whispered throughout the basin. A cattle baron from back east who bought land lawmen and loyalty with equal ease. He was squeezing the homesteaders one by one with tactics that skirted the edge of the law and often fell right off. "You're a soldier," she stated, looking at the faded corporal stripes on his sleeve. A flicker of something panic maybe crossed his face. They left me for dead. All of them. Dead. He coughed, a racking sound that brought a fresh bloom of red to his lips. "My name is Aidan. Aidan Vance." She made a decision. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Dragging him inside was a risk that could bring that same sentence down on her. She chose the risk. With a strength born of years of hard labor, she hauled him to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulders, and half dragged, half carried him into the cool dimness of her cabin. For 3 days, he drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Amelia cleaned and stitched his wound a nasty gash from a bowie knife, by the look of it. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, listening to his fragmented murmurs. He spoke of orders of a place called Widow's Creek, of betrayal. He mentioned a man named Jedediah Kane, a name she knew belonged to Blackwood's notoriously cruel foreman. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Aidan woke with clear eyes and a crushing awareness of his own vulnerability. He watched her as she moved about the small cabin, stoking the fire, checking her dwindling supplies. He saw the calloused hands, the sun-bleached strands in her tightly braided brown hair, and the unwavering competence in her every move. She wasn't soft, but there was a deep well of kindness in her that she tried to hide behind a stoic mask. "You saved my life," he said, his voice weak but clear. Amelia didn't turn from the hearth. "You're not dead yet. Don't thank me until you're sure you won't bring trouble down on me for it." "I won't," he promised. "As soon as I can ride, I'll be gone." "Ride what?" she asked flatly. "Your horse is gone. Your gear, too. Whoever ambushed you took everything." A shadow passed over his face. He pushed himself up, wincing as the stitches in his side pulled. "I have to get out of here. I have to warn them." "Warn who?" He hesitated, his gaze guarded. "People. Settlers. Blackwood. He's not just buying land. He's clearing it. My patrol. We weren't just on reconnaissance. We were investigating him. We had proof. Affidavits from families he ran off. Proof of murder." The air in the cabin grew cold. This was bigger than she had imagined. She had steered clear of the basin's politics, focusing only on her own survival. But now the war had bled onto her doorstep. "The proof is gone," she said. "Your men are dead. You're one wounded man against Silas Blackwood. It's over." "No!" He insisted, his eyes burning with a desperate fire. "The proof isn't gone. It's here." He tapped his temple. "I know who he paid. I know the names of the men he hired to do his killing. I know where the bodies are buried. But that knowledge dies with me if I can't get to Fort Grant. Fort Grant is 100 miles of badlands from here." She scoffed. "You can barely stand." "I know," he said, his voice dropping. He looked from her face to the open doorway, where Saul stood in the corral, his golden coat gleaming in the afternoon light. The stallion was the picture of power and speed. Aidan's gaze lingered on the horse, and an idea desperate and audacious took root in his mind. He looked back at her, his expression one of profound, agonizing appeal. "Miss Hayes, Amelia, I need to ask you for something. Something no sane person would grant a stranger." She knew what was coming. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "I need your horse." The silence that followed his request was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind. Amelia stared at him, her face an unreadable mask. To ask for her horse was to ask for her legs, her freedom, her future. It was the single most valuable thing she possessed, the one thing that stood between her and total destitution. "No," she said. The word was flat final. "Absolutely not." Aidan didn't flinch. He seemed to have expected it. He slowly, painfully swung his legs over the side of the cot, his face pale with the effort. "I understand. I wouldn't agree if I were you. But you have to know what's at stake." He began to talk, He painted a picture of Silas Blackwood, not just as a greedy rancher, but as a predator. He spoke of the Miller family burned out of their home in the middle of the night. He spoke of old Mark Taggart, a prospector who'd found a small seam of silver and was later found at the bottom of a canyon, his claim filed under Blackwood's name the very next day. He spoke of Widow's Creek, a small, fertile pocket of land where a dozen families were trying to make a stand, the last bastion of resistance against Blackwood's ever-expanding empire. Jedediah Kane delivered Blackwood's final offer last month. Aidan said, his voice low and urgent. Sell for pennies on the dollar or be carried out in a pine box. They sent a petition to the territorial governor. That's why my patrol was sent. We weren't just soldiers. We were the governor's response. A quiet one. If we disappeared... He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. No one at Fort Grant knows our real mission. They'll just mark us as deserted or killed by natives. Blackwood will have won. He'll wipe Widow's Creek off the map. Amelia's own small plot of land with its reliable spring was a jewel in this arid basin. She knew with a cold certainty that Blackwood would come for her eventually. Helping Aidan was an act of self-preservation as much as anything else. But Saul, why my horse? She asked, her voice tight. There are other homesteads, other horses. None like him, Aidan answered, his gaze turning to the corral. I saw him when you brought me in. The way he moves. He's got speed, but more than that, he has heart. You can see it. That's 100-mile horse. A horse that won't quit when the land gets hard and the water is scarce. A horse that can outrun anything Kane and his men can throw at him. He's the only chance I have. Over the next few days, a strange and fragile truce settled between them. As Aidan regained his strength, he began to help her with small chores. He repaired the broken hinge on her cabin door, his hands surprisingly deft. He sat on the porch, sharpening her axe with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape-scrape, a calming sound in the vast silence. He never pushed, never pleaded about the horse again. But the question was always there, unspoken in his clear blue eyes. Amelia found herself watching him. He was quiet and observant. He noticed how she favored her left shoulder when she lifted the water buckets, and without a word began fetching the water for her. He listened when she spoke, not just waiting for his turn to talk, but truly hearing her. She told him about her father, about their dream of building a real ranch here, and about the loneliness that was sometimes so vast, it felt like a physical presence. He in turn told her about his life before the army, about a farm in Ohio, with green hills and seasons that changed a world away from the stark, brutal beauty of the basin. He spoke with a quiet longing that resonated with her own. A bond, tentative and delicate, began to form in the shared solitude. She started to see not just a wounded soldier, but a man named Aidan. A good man, she suspected, caught in a very bad situation. One evening, as twilight painted the mazes in shades of purple and rose, they sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. "If you get to Fort Grant," she said suddenly, "what then? You think they'll send the cavalry charging in on your word alone?" "No," he admitted. "My commander, Major Wallace, is a cautious man. But he's an honorable one. My testimony will be enough to launch a formal investigation to get the U.S. Marshals involved. It will be enough to put Blackwood on notice. It will buy the people at Widow's Creek time." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Amelia, I am not a man who breaks his word. If you do this, if you lend me your horse, I swear on my mother's grave that I will bring him back to you, or I will die trying." She looked at his earnest, tired face. She looked out at the endless expanse of land, feeling smaller and more isolated than ever. She thought of the Miller family of old Mark Taggart. She thought of her own spring, her own small claim on this earth. Her father had always told her, "You don't fight a rattler by waiting for it to strike. You kill it in its nest." Blackwood was the rattler. Aidan, for all his weakness, was the only one who knew where the nest was. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can leave at dawn." A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over his face. "Thank you, Amelia. You won't regret this?" "I already do," she replied honestly. That night sleep eluded her. She lay on her cot listening to the man's steady breathing from the other side of the small cabin. She was placing her entire existence into the hands of a stranger she'd known for less than a week. A man who, for all she knew, could be a liar, a deserter, a thief. He could be riding Saul to California, never to be seen again. Before dawn, she was up. She packed a saddlebag for him, a full canteen, a strip of jerky, and a small pouch of oats for Saul. She led the stallion from the corral. Saul nudged her hand, his intelligent eyes questioning. She wrapped her arms around his powerful neck, burying her face in his coarse mane. It smelled of dust and sun and freedom. "You bring him back, Saul," she whispered into his ear. "You hear me? You bring yourself home." Aidan emerged from the cabin, dressed in a spare shirt and trousers she'd given him. He moved stiffly, but his jaw was set with determination. He looked from her to the horse, his gratitude too deep for words. He took the reins from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt through her. "I will come back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For the horse, and for you." Before she could process his words, he swung himself into the saddle, his face tight with pain. He gave her one last, long look, a look that held 1,000 unspoken promises and apologies. Then he turned Saul to the east and kicked him into a gallop. Amelia stood alone in the vast, empty yard, watching as the cloud of dust grew smaller and smaller until the golden speck that was her entire world vanished into the blood-red sunrise. The silence that descended was heavier and more profound than any she had ever known. She had gambled everything on a stranger's word, and now the waiting began. The days that followed Aidan's departure were a study in emptiness. The silence in the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was a hollow ache. The corral, empty of Saul's vibrant presence, looked like a skeleton. Every morning, Amelia scanned the eastern horizon, a fool's hope warring with a bitter, growing certainty that she had been played. She cursed her weakness, her foolish compassion. She had let a man with honest eyes and a sad story walk away with her life. Her work was her only solace. She threw herself into the back-breaking labor of the homestead, mending fences, clearing new ground, hauling water, until her muscles screamed in protest. The physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic for the turmoil in her mind. A little over a week after Aidan left, the first real sign of trouble appeared. 2 men on horseback rode up to her property line. They didn't approach the cabin, just sat their horses watching. One was a hulking, bearded man she didn't recognize. The other, lean and wiry with a cruel twist to his mouth, was Jedediah Kane. Amelia stood on her porch, the Winchester held loosely in her hands, its presence a clear warning. Kane tipped his hat in a mocking gesture. "Mornin', Miss Hayes," he called out, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "Just admiring your plot. Fine piece of land. That spring of yours must be a godsend in this heat." "It does its job," Amelia said, her voice level. "This is private property." "Oh, we know." Kane smirked. "But everything has a price. Mr. Blackwood is a generous man. He's authorized me to offer you a fair sum for your claim, enough to see you settled real comfortable in a town somewhere, a place more suited for a lady on her own. I'm not selling." Kane's smirk tightened. "That's what they all say at first, but this is hard country. Lonely, dangerous. A woman alone. Things can happen. Accidents, fires. A well can go foul." The threat was as clear as the morning sky. "The only thing that's going to happen here, Mr. Kane, is you turning your horses around and riding off my land. Now." Kane's eyes narrowed, scanning her property. He noted the empty corral. "Where's that fine dun of yours? I've seen you on him. Fastest horse in the basin, I'd wager." A cold knot of fear tightened in Amelia's stomach. "He's gone lame. Put him out to pasture in the high meadows to heal." It was a weak lie, but the best she could come up with. Kane's eyes lingered on her for a moment, a flicker of suspicion in their depths. Then he laughed a short, ugly sound. "Have it your way, Miss Hayes. But Mr. Blackwood is a patient man, and I ain't. The offer stands. For now." He and his man wheeled their horses around and trotted off, leaving a cloud of dust and menace in their wake. Amelia's hands were shaking. They knew about Saul, and now they knew he was gone. Her greatest defense, her means of escape, was 100 miles away. She was trapped. The harassment escalated. A few nights later, she was woken by the smell of smoke. The far corner of her pasture was on fire. By the time she managed to beat it out with a wet sack, a quarter-acre of precious winter grazing had been turned to black ash. There was no doubt it was a message. A week later, she found her small vegetable garden, trampled the plants, ripped from the earth. The final, most chilling act came when she went to her well. The water, usually so clear and sweet, was cloudy. She pulled up the bucket to find the bloated, decaying carcass of a coyote fouling her water supply. It took her 2 full days of back-breaking work to haul the animal out, empty the well bucket by bucket, and wait for the spring to slowly refill with clean water. During that time, she survived on the water in her canteen, her fear a constant metallic taste in her mouth. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. The isolation she had once cherished had become a prison, and the walls were closing in. Despair began to set in. Aidan was not coming back. He was a liar, a thief who had used a story of heroism to steal her horse and leave her to the wolves. The settlers at Widow's Creek were likely a fiction, a figment of his story designed to win her sympathy. She had been a fool, and now she would pay the price. She began to make plans. She couldn't stay. Without water, and with Kane's threats growing bolder, it was only a matter of time. She would have to pack what she could carry on her back and set out for redemption on foot. It was a 50-mile walk through unforgiving terrain. Her chances were slim. One afternoon, as she was rationing her last bag of flour, a rider approached. It wasn't Kane. This man was old, his face a road map of wrinkles, and he rode a tired-looking mule. He stopped a respectful distance from her cabin. "Miss Hayes," he called out, his voice raspy. "My name is Jebediah Finch. I'm from Widow's Creek." Amelia's heart stopped. She raised the Winchester. "I don't know anyone from Widow's Creek." The old man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I reckon you don't. But Corporal Vance sent me. He made it to the fort." The words hit her like a physical blow. He made it. The relief was so sudden and overwhelming it almost buckled her knees. "He told me to come check on you." Jebediah continued, his eyes sad. "Said he was worried Blackwood's men might give you trouble. Looks like he was right." He gestured with his chin towards the scorched pasture and the disturbed ground around the well. "What happened at the fort?" she asked, her voice strained. "Are they sending help?" Jebediah Finch shook his head slowly, and the fragile hope that had just bloomed in Amelia's chest withered and died. The corporal gave his report to Major Wallace, told him everything. But the Major, he's a by-the-book man. He said a corporal's uncorroborated testimony wasn't enough to move against a man as powerful as Silas Blackwood. He called it local land disputes. He's launching an internal inquiry, which means he's filing paperwork that'll take 6 months to get to Washington. "So he's doing nothing," Amelia said, the bitterness returning. "Worse than nothing," the old man said, his voice grim. "News travels fast. Blackwood has friends at the fort. He knows Aidan is alive and what he's accused him of. He's not going to wait for the marshals. He's decided to end this now. He's given everyone at Widow's Creek a final ultimatum. Be gone by the first snow or he'll burn us out. He's gathering every hired gun and lowlife from here to the border." Amelia felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Aidan had succeeded only in making things worse. He hadn't brought the law down on Blackwood. He had enraged him. "And Corporal Vance?" she asked. "Where is he?" Jebediah looked down at his hands, resting on the pommel of his saddle. "That's the other thing. Major Wallace was displeased. He saw the corporal's mission as a failure, accused him of losing his men, his equipment. He confined Corporal Vance to the stockade, pending a court-martial for dereliction of duty. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Aidan wasn't a hero riding back with the cavalry. He was a prisoner locked away, while the monster he'd tried to expose was preparing to slaughter a whole community of innocent people. And he still had her horse. Saul was likely in an army stable, or sold off to the highest bidder. She was alone, defenseless, and the shadow of Silas Blackwood was about to swallow everything. The gamble hadn't just failed, it had backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The stockade at Fort Grant was a small, sun-baked square of hell. Aidan Vance sat on the edge of his cot, the damning words of Major Wallace echoing in his head. Uncorroborated testimony. Civilian matter. Dereliction of duty. He had failed. He had risked everything, had watched his men die, had borrowed a horse that was a woman's entire life, and for what to be locked in a cage while Blackwood prepared his final move. His greatest torment was the thought of Amelia. He had promised to return to protect her. Instead, he had painted a target on her back and left her completely defenseless. Her image, her steady grey eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the unexpected kindness in her touch haunted his waking hours and his feverish dreams. He'd been in the stockade for 2 weeks when the lock on his cell door scraped open late one night. A young private, a boy named Miller, whose family had once owned a farm near Widow's Creek before Blackwood's men ran them off, stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Corporal," the private whispered, "you need to come with me. Quietly." Aidan didn't hesitate. He followed the boy through the sleeping fort to the stables. In one of the stalls stood Saul, saddled and ready. The sight of the magnificent horse sent a pang of guilt and gratitude through him. "Where did you—" "A few of us. We're from the basin." Private Miller cut him off. "We know what Blackwood is. We also know the Major won't do a thing." "This ain't right, sir." Another figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Jebediah Finch. "Good to see you on your feet, Corporal," the old man rasped. "But we have to ride. Now." "What's happening?" Aidan demanded, swinging into Saul's saddle. The horse felt strong and eager beneath him, a living bolt of lightning. "I went to see the Hayes woman like you asked," Jebediah said, as they rode quietly out of the fort service gate. "She's alive. But Cain's been at her. Burned her pasture, poisoned her well. She's hanging on by a thread. And Blackwood. He's done waiting. He's sent riders to every saloon and back-alley card game in the territory. He's building an army of thugs. He means to wipe Widow's Creek out for good." A cold fury settled over Aidan. And Major Wallace just sits there. "He's not the only one with a stake in this," Jebediah said grimly. They rode hard through the night meeting, up with a small group of men on a moonlit plain. Aidan recognized some of them. There was Mark's boy, Ben Taggart, his face hard with the memory of his murdered father. There were the two Cole brothers whose ranch had been stolen through forged documents. A half-dozen men armed with old farm rifles and a burning need for justice. "This is it?" Aidan asked, his heart sinking. "This is all of us." "For now," Ben Taggart said, spitting on the ground. "But there are more. Families Blackwood has broken and scattered. They've been waiting for a leader. Someone who ain't afraid to stand up. We heard you were that man. We heard you faced down the Major himself." Aidan realized the truth. His arrest hadn't been seen as a failure by these men. It had been seen as a badge of honor. He was the soldier who had told the truth to a bureaucracy that didn't want to hear it. He was the one Blackwood couldn't kill. So began a desperate, frantic ride across the territory. They rode not to the main settlements, but to the isolated homesteads, the mining camps, and the dusty ranches tucked away in hidden valleys. Aidan, mounted on the tireless Saul, became their rallying cry. The story of his ambush, his survival, and Amelia's selfless act spread like wildfire. He was no longer just Corporal Vance. He was the man who had been left for dead and had come back. In a small hidden valley they found a dozen families living in a makeshift camp. They were the farmers from the Green River Flats, forced off their land by Blackwood damming their water supply. At a remote mining encampment, they recruited men who had been cheated out of their claims by Blackwood's lawyers. They weren't an army. They were a collection of the dispossessed. They were fathers, sons, and husbands. Some were old, some were barely men. Their weapons were a motley collection of hunting rifles, shotguns, and old pistols, but they all shared a common enemy and a burning desire for retribution. They began to call themselves the Widow's Creek Militia. Aidan, using his cavalry training, began to shape them into a cohesive unit. He taught them how to ride in formation, how to use signals, how to lay an ambush. He discovered that Ben Taggart was a crack shot, that the Cole brothers knew the terrain better than any map, and that old Jebediah Finch, for all his age, had a calming influence that could steady the rawest nerves. His thoughts, however, were never far from Amelia. He was using her horse to lead this ragged army, a horse she had lent him, to seek official justice, not to start a war. He had dragged her into this, and his fear for her safety was a constant, gnawing ache. He was asking these men to fight, and possibly die, for their homes. But Amelia's home was the most exposed of all. She was sitting directly in Blackwood's path. "We need to get back," Aidan said to Jebediah and Ben one evening, as they camped in the shadow of a mesa. They had gathered nearly 50 men. It wasn't enough not against the 100+ guns Blackwood had likely hired, but it would have to be. Blackwood will move on Widow's Creek soon, but he'll go through Amelia's homestead first. He wants that spring. "It's a trap, Corporal," Ben Taggart argued. "He'll be expecting us to defend the creek. He won't be expecting a fight at a lone woman's cabin." "Exactly," Aidan replied, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "He'll be arrogant. He'll send a smaller force led by Kane. He'll want to make an example of her before he moves on the main settlement. He thinks she's alone and defenseless. He's not expecting an army to be waiting for him there." It was a colossal gamble. He would be leading this fledgling militia into their first battle at the home of the woman he'd endangered. He would be riding her horse back to her, not as a lone man, returning what he'd borrowed, but as the leader of a rebellion. He looked at the faces around the campfire farmers, not soldiers, and felt the crushing weight of his responsibility. He had started this, and he had to see it through. "We ride for the Red Rock Basin at first light," he announced, his voice ringing with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "We're going to give Mr. Blackwood a surprise." As he lay under the stars that night, he cleaned his revolver, the metallic clicks loud in the quiet camp. He was no longer just a corporal following orders. He was the commander of the desperate and the damned, and he was leading them all back to Amelia Hayes's front door. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years that he wasn't leading them all to their graves. The end came for Amelia on a cold, grey morning. The sky was the colour of lead, and the wind had a sharp, biting edge that promised the first snow was not far off. She had packed a small bundle of her most precious belongings, her mother's locket, her father's worn Bible, and a small tin of seeds for next spring, a pathetic symbol of a future she no longer believed she would have. Her plan was to slip away under the cover of darkness, to begin the long, perilous walk to redemption. But she had waited one day too long. The sound came first, a low rumble that grew into the thunder of dozens of horses. Amelia's blood ran cold. She grabbed the Winchester and ran to the window. Cresting the ridge to the west was a column of at least 30 riders, with the lean, cruel silhouette of Jedediah Kane at their head. They weren't riding with the caution of men expecting a fight. They rode with the arrogant swagger of bullies coming to kick over a child's sandcastle. This was the final visit. Her cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a coffin. There was nowhere to run. The open basin offered no cover. Her only chance was to make a stand, to sell her life as dearly as she could. She barricaded the door with her heavy wooden table and checked the load in her rifle. Her hands were steady, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Kane and his men fanned out surrounding the small homestead. "Amelia Hayes," his voice boomed across the yard. "Last chance. Walk away from this place with the clothes on your back, and Mr. Blackwood might let you live to see the sun rise. Stay, and we'll burn this shack to the ground, with you in it." Amelia raised the Winchester, resting the barrel on the windowsill. She sighted on Kane's chest. "You set 1 foot closer, Kane, and I'll send you to hell myself," she yelled back, her voice clear and defiant. A cruel laugh was her only answer. "Have it your way." He raised his arm, a signal to his men to advance. This was it. The end of her stand, the end of her life. She took a deep breath, her finger tightening on the trigger. And then, the world changed. From the east, from the direction Aidan had vanished so many weeks ago, came an answer to Kane's riders. It was a new sound, a different thunder. Another column of riders appeared, cresting the opposite ridge, silhouetted against the grim grey sky. They were not a uniform line of soldiers, but a ragged collection of men on farm horses and mules. But they rode with a purpose, a grim determination that sent a shiver down Kane's spine. At their head, riding with an authority that seemed both natural and terrifying, was a single figure. He was mounted on a magnificent golden dun stallion that ate up the ground with a powerful, fluid grace. The horse gleamed like a beacon of hope against the bleak landscape. It was Saul. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of disbelief and soaring, impossible hope. It was him, Aidan Vance. He had come back, but he wasn't alone. He was leading an army. Her horse, the horse she had lent him to find the law, was now at the forefront of a war. The sight broke the spell of arrogance that had held Kane and his men. They reined in their horses, confusion turning to alarm. They had expected a lone, terrified woman. They were now facing 50 armed, angry men who had appeared from nowhere. Aidan raised his hand, and his militia halted, a line of grim-faced farmers and ranchers ready for battle. He trotted Saul forward until he was halfway between the two forces. His eyes weren't on Cain. They were locked on the window of the small cabin, searching for any sign of Amelia. "Cain!" Aidan's voice rang out clear and commanding, cutting through the tense silence. "This is not her fight. This is between Blackwood and us. The men you've robbed, the families you've terrorized. Leave now and you might live to see a jail cell." Cain, recovering from his shock, was filled with rage. He had been made a fool. "You're a deserter, Vance. A dead man. These are just dirt farmers. You think this rabble can stand against us?" He drew his pistol. "Kill him!" He fired the shot, cracking through the air. But Aidan was already moving. Saul, responding to an infinitesimal cue, sidestepped, and the bullet whizzed harmlessly past. In that same instant, a rifle shot rang out from the militia's line. Ben Taggart, perched on one knee, had fired. The man next to Cain cried out and tumbled from his saddle, clutching a shattered shoulder. Chaos erupted. The basin, once a place of profound silence, became a maelstrom of gunfire, shouting, and the terrified whinnying of horses. Cain's hired guns, a disorganized mob of bullies, were momentarily stunned by the disciplined volley from the militia. Aidan, a true cavalryman, saw his opening. "Flanks Cole brothers take the creek bed," he roared. "Taggart hold the center, Jebediah with me." He spurred Saul forward, not as a lone target, but as the tip of a spear. A dozen men, with old Jebediah Finch at his side, charged with him. They crashed into Cain's disorganized line, turning the confrontation into a frantic, close-quarters brawl. Inside the cabin, Amelia was frozen for only a second. This was her land, her fight. He hadn't just come back for his war, he had come back for her. Shoving the table from the door, she burst outside, her Winchester at her shoulder. She was no damsel to be rescued. She was the owner of this homestead, and it was time to evict the trespassers. She didn't aim for the men. Her targets were the horses. A shot fired at the ground in front of a charging horse sent it rearing, unseating its rider. She became a vital anchor on the militia's flank, her knowledge of the terrain and her steady aim breaking the charge of several of Blackwood's men trying to circle around the cabin. She saw Aidan in the swirling chaos. He moved with a deadly grace, his army revolver bucking in his hand. He was no longer the weak, wounded man she had nursed back to health. He was a commander, a warrior, his face a mask of cold fury and determination. He and Saul moved as one, a golden whirlwind of righteous vengeance in the heart of the battle. Her heart swelled with a fierce, terrifying pride. This was the man she had gambled on, the man who had ridden her horse back, leading an army of the wronged, to the place where it all began. The battle for the Red Rock Basin had started in her front yard. The fight for Amelia's homestead was not a battle. It was a storm. The air filled with a maelstrom of gunfire, the screams of men, and the terrified whinnying of horses. The Widow's Creek militia, though, outmatched, fought with the savage desperation of men defending their last worldly hope. They were not soldiers, but they were landowners, and they made every bullet count. Cain's hired guns, accustomed to terrorizing unarmed families, faltered against this wall of righteous fury. Aidan was the storm's center. Atop the magnificent Saul, he was a whirlwind of motion and command, his presence a beacon for his ragged army. He broke charges, rallied wavering men, and fought with the cold precision of a seasoned cavalryman. He and the Golden Stallion moved as one, a singular force of retribution that seemed to be everywhere at once. From the porch of her cabin, Amelia was a steadfast anchor in the chaos. This was her land, and she defended it with an intimate knowledge of every rock and depression. Her Winchester spoke with deadly authority, not to kill, but to cripple the assault. A shot into the dust before a charging horse sent it rearing, unseating its rider. A bullet splintering the stock of a rifle caused a man to drop his weapon in shock. She was not a soldier, but she was a survivor, and her home was an extension of her unbending will. Jedediah Cain, watching his attack crumble, was consumed by rage. He saw Emilia, the defiant woman, who was the source of this humiliating resistance. With a guttural snarl, he spurred his horse directly toward her, his revolver raised, intending to make her the ultimate example. "I'll deal with you myself, you witch," he bellowed. Aidan saw the charge and roared Emilia's name, wheeling Saul to intercept, but he was too far caught on the other side of the swirling melee. Emilia saw Cain thundering towards her, a black wave of hatred intent on washing her away. There was no time to reload the Winchester. She dropped it, her hands moving with a fluid calm she did not feel. She drew the small, pearl-handled pistol her father had given her, a weapon she'd always considered a keepsake. It was all she had. She stood her ground as the foreman bore down on her. She didn't flinch. With both hands to steady her nerve, she raised the small pistol, aimed and fired. The shot was a mere pop in the symphony of violence, but its aim was true. Cain cried out in surprise, a red flower blooming on his shooting arm. The sudden pain caused him to wrench the reins, and his spooked horse reared violently. The foreman was thrown from the saddle, his head striking a large rock by the well with a sickening crack. Jedediah Cain, the terror of the basin, lay still. The sight of their leader's fall shattered the hired gun's morale. A few threw down their weapons, but any cry of victory from the militia died in their throats. On the northern ridge, a second far larger army appeared, silhouetted against the leaden sky. At its head, on a massive black stallion, was Silas Blackwood himself, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He had arrived expecting to oversee a simple eviction, not to find his advance force broken and his foreman dead. The real battle was just beginning. "Wipe them out!" Blackwood's voice boomed across the basin, a promise of total annihilation. "Leave no one standing. I want Vance's head on a pike." His army surged forward, and the desperate firefight became a brutal siege. The militia was now hopelessly outnumbered. Blackwood's men, dismounting to use the rocks for cover, poured a relentless fire onto the small homestead. Wood splintered from the cabin walls, and bullets ricocheted off the corral fence. The defenders were pinned down, their ammunition dwindling, their small victory turning to ash. Amidst the hail of lead, Aidan knew they couldn't win this way. They were being encircled, bled dry. Their only hope was to cut the head from the snake. He caught Emilia's eye as she reloaded behind a water trough. "I have to get to Blackwood," he yelled over the din. She didn't argue or plead for him to be safe. She simply saw the stark necessity in his eyes and gave a sharp, determined nod. "Go." That one word was all the blessing he needed. Spurring Saul, he didn't charge into the fray. Instead, he veered left, galloping into a shallow gully she had once shown him, an old game trail invisible to outsiders. Hidden from the main line of fire, he raced along the basin's hidden contours. Saul, a creature of this wild land, moved with breathtaking speed and agility, leaping over obstacles as if born to it. Aidan burst from the gully onto the flank of the knoll, where Blackwood was directing the assault. He crashed into the rancher's personal guards before they could react, his revolver bucking, disrupting their formation and sowing chaos. In seconds, he was through them, and only Silas Blackwood remained. Roaring in fury, Blackwood wheeled his powerful stallion and charged, raising a heavy cavalry saber to cut Aidan down. Aidan holstered his empty pistol and drew his army-issue bowie knife, a meager tool against a warrior's sword. The horses collided in a shower of dirt and fury. Blackwood's saber whistled through the air, a blow meant to cleave a man in two. Aidan ducked beneath the deadly arc, urging Saul to push past the larger horse. In that fleeting moment of closeness, Aidan didn't strike at the man. He slashed out with his knife, slicing through the thick leather straps of Blackwood's saddle cinch. The cut was deep and true. As Blackwood reined in his horse to turn for another pass, his saddle, now unsecured, slid sideways. With a bellow of shocked surprise, the powerful cattle baron toppled from his mount, landing in an undignified heap. Before he could scramble for his pistol, Aidan was off Saul. The point of his knife pressed hard against Blackwood's throat. The fighting across the basin faltered as every eye turned to the drama on the knoll. "It's over, Blackwood," Aidan panted. "Tell your men to stand down." Blackwood's face was purple with humiliation. He opened his mouth not to surrender, but to roar one last defiant command. The command never came. A single sharp rifle crack echoed from the homestead below. Blackwood's eyes went wide, a neat dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He collapsed, his empire of fear ending in the dust. Aidan looked down at the cabin. Amelia stood on the porch, her Winchester resting on the rail, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. Her face was pale but resolute. She had ended the war she never asked for. With their leader dead, the last of Blackwood's army threw down their weapons in surrender. In the quiet aftermath, the basin began to heal. The U.S. Marshals finally arrived to take the prisoners and formalize the peace that the homesteaders had won with their own blood. Days later, Aidan found Amelia by the corral, where Saul was contentedly eating oats. The setting sun painted the scarred land in hues of gold and rose. "I promised I'd bring him back," Aidan said softly. "You kept your word," she replied, her gaze fixed on the horse that had tied their fates together. He stepped closer, his heart full of words he didn't know how to say. "Amelia, I came back for more than the horse." She finally turned to him, and her steady grey eyes held a universe of understanding. "I know." He reached out and took her calloused hand. It was a simple touch, but it was a promise. Their fight was over, but the work of building a future from the ashes was just beginning. Looking out at the vast, silent land, they knew they would not have to do it alone. And so the story of Amelia Hayes and Aidan Vance became a legend in the Red Rock Basin, a testament to the fact that even in the most lawless of lands, courage and compassion can spark a revolution. It's a story about how one act of kindness, a gamble on a stranger's honor, can change the fate of an entire community. It reminds us that heroes aren't always soldiers in uniform. Sometimes they are quiet, stubborn homesteaders who refuse to back down, and that true strength is found not in isolation, but in the bonds we forge in the face of tyranny. If this story of love, betrayal, and redemption in the untamed West moved you, please show your support. These tales are our passion, and your engagement helps us bring more of them to you. Please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a classic Western, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories from the frontier to tell, and we'd be honored to have you along for the ride. Thank you for listening.